Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this session this afternoon. It's brilliant to see so many of you here. My name is Lucy Manning. I'm a special correspondent for BBC News. I've spent the last couple of years doing quite a lot of reporting on terrorism, on extremism. I covered the murder of Lee Rigby and Woolwich, the trial of Michael Adebowale and Michael Adebolajo. 10 days ago, I was part of the team that revealed the name of Mohammed Emwazi as Jihadi John and have spent the last 10 days reporting on that. The issue of women in extremism is a really current one. It's not a new one, but it's a current one. Just last week, one of the senior officers from Scotland Yard said that there are 60 British women, they believe, who have gone to fight with the so-called, gone and joined the so-called Islamic State in Syria. And this year, 20 of those girls who are gone are under the age of 20, and the last 5 women to have gone are just 15 and 16 years of age. I'm delighted to have a really outstanding panel here today. We have Sasha Havlicek, who is the CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and she's done a lot of media work recently on the issue of women going to Syria. We have Åsne Seierstad, who many of you may have read her book, The Bookseller of Kabul, a very award-winning book, and she has just written a book about Anders Breivik and the massacre in Norway. It's called One of Us, and we're really delighted to have you here today. And then at the far end, Shabana Kausar, who is the Women's Aid National Schools Engagement Officer, and does work with schools on domestic abuse and used to do some work on extremism. So I think what we'll do is we have a bit of time. I'll ask, we were supposed to have Hanif Qadir here as well, and unfortunately he has a family illness, so he's unable to be with us. But what I'll do is I will ask each of them to give a small introduction, then I'll do some questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So maybe if I can just ask Sasha to start.
Sure. Just to say a huge thank you. It's overwhelming and inspiring to be here at this sort of setting with so many incredible women around. I don't get a chance working in the security sector to work nearly enough with women. And given the nature of the challenges that we're facing in terms of radicalization and recruitment, and I work on that issue across ideologies, from far right to Islamist, and I work on that issue across the gender divide, of course. But we often see very old school security style responses to a challenge that is new in the sense that it is essentially about a movement. And in beating a movement, we need to be thinking much more innovatively about the sorts of responses that we deploy, and I hope we can talk a little bit about that later. My background is in conflict resolution. My family was from the Balkans. I saw Yugoslavia implode into a genocidal catastrophe, and watching that up close gave me an insight into some of how extremist ideology can grab a hold of even the most absolutely normal people in an integrated, peaceful environment, and how quickly that can happen. In the context of the Yugoslav conflict, that denouement really took place over the course of 1 or 2 years, a very systematic media, top-down media frenzy that drove people, whipped people up into a kind of fear that enabled them to do things that are unimaginable, unspeakable. And I came back to the UK in 2006 to set up the Institute because I was struck by the nature of the discourse that had started, I thought, to take hold across Europe, across Western societies, the extent to which communal issues had started to become really rife, and the extent to which we'd started to see what I thought was a set of cumulative extremisms with Islamist, if you like, and far-right populist extremisms goading each other. They are in many ways each other's best recruiting grounds and best recruiting operators. And we see that in very practical ways. And I hope we can talk, I've been asked to come and talk a little bit specifically about this rising trend of women supporting and migrating to Syria to join ISIS. It's an issue that we've done a lot of research on, and that we are trying to look at innovative ways in which to respond in a kind of whole of society response and approach. So I look forward to sharing a bit of that.
From your analysis and the work that you're doing at the moment, where would you say we are on the issue of women and extremism, and how bad that issue is at the moment, how much of a concern it actually is?
I mean, we've all heard already that this is not a problem that is either confined to specific ideologies. It's also not new. I mean, women's participation and involvement in extremist organizations and terrorist organizations is as old as time. I think that there are certain aspects of the challenge that we're currently seeing in terms of the exodus of young people from across Europe and the West as a whole to Syria that are fairly unique, and we shouldn't underplay how big a challenge this is. Just in terms of numbers, we're talking about unprecedented numbers of young people as a whole going. We are now talking about something in the region of 3,000 Europeans having already gone to Syria, some of them having come back already. Of that number, some 550 are likely to be women. And that's absolutely official estimate, so the number is likely to be higher than that. That is really an extraordinary number of people. I think the nature of this is interesting because it challenges a whole host of assumptions that as a society I think we readily make. I think we tend to believe that women are essentially victims of extremism, especially Muslim women, that Muslim women must be victims of a certain type of fundamentalist ideology. And here what we see is the complete upending of those ideas. This is a group of women that, lo and behold, are ideologically committed. So young women are just as capable of ideological radicalization as young men.
But some people would say, when you look at the young schoolgirls who have just gone from Bethnal Green Academy, 15, 16 years of age, that they are victims, that yes, they've gone to fight for this very extreme, not fight, but to join up with this extremist group. But they have, in some ways, been brainwashed, and they are victims, and their families are victims.
So I would just say, absolutely, as much as young boys at that age. And I think that the idea somehow that we have as a society that the girls are more likely to have been victimized than the boys, also minors, also being very, very aggressively recruited, is a mistake. So young women we're seeing equally capable of radicalization, of ideological commitment. We shouldn't underestimate that. And I think the real problem here, and you've talked about the push factors, about the sorts of problems that young people might face that justifies in their minds joining these kinds of organizations and groups. I'd love to talk a little bit about the pull factor, because I think that's been absolutely unique in this case.
I mean, what is attractive?
What is it that essentially gets... And most of the time what we're seeing is that these are educated middle-class kids, and in particular with the girls, very successful academically. The three girls that just went, Aksa Mahmood before, I mean, really talented young women that you could imagine doing many, many other things, being drawn into this. And I think we've vastly underestimated the strength of this incredibly sophisticated, tech-savvy propaganda recruitment machinery that's been deployed. In the recent period, it's been hypercharged through social media and the internet. And we're talking about a really, really sophisticated peer-to-peer marketing strategy that would be the envy of many social media marketing companies. They know how to sell something very specifically to very specific constituencies. And women have been a target. The female factor is valued by extremist organizations, even though women have been completely underestimated by the security services in this space. And they're valued for a number of reasons. I think they're not valued because, as we can see from the press response, they have massively high PR value for these organizations, because they're saying, look, we chose to leave our lives in the West and to join this movement. That says something. They're valuable because they are part of a troop morale strategy. There's a marriage bureau that was set up in Raqqa. So these girls are arriving out there, being match made with young jihadis out there. They're valuable because this project is not just about fighting. Brand Caliphate is drawing women in unprecedented numbers because it's about building the new state. It's about a heroic, historic project about building a new world. And so they're being deployed to come and rear the next generation of jihadis, and part of their ideological commitment is in fact to be part of that project of rearing that generation of jihadis. And I think that the propaganda machinery is something that we haven't been looking at enough, but it's not new. It's based on 25 years of a very successful propaganda and recruitment machinery that has been successfully really targeting very young people and increasingly younger and younger people. So there is a kind of grooming dimension to this, although it's not sexual in nature.
Sasha, do you want
just
to comment
on your point? I think you're absolutely right. It's a combination of the push and the pull factors, and it's extremely complex. I wanted to come to your point about empowerment, because I think it's counterintuitive for us to imagine that this is something that empowers young women, but that's exactly how they're seeing it, and we have to understand their own motivations in order to get ahead of the curve and deal with the problem. We've been monitoring the social media accounts of ISIS supporters and girls that have gone off to Syria, and it's fascinating to listen to the language that they use, that their own rationale for joining, and how deeply empowering they see this movement, despite the fact that on the ground, and we know what the realities are, we've seen now the publication of the Al-Qanza Moral Brigade's manifesto, and it's, marrying girls off at 9, and it's, not allowing women out of the home without supervision and all the rest. But actually, in terms of the motivation to get out there, and I think there is something that we really need to understand. There's a reaction, I think, a twofold reaction. One is a reaction often to very conservative milieus, and so these are not in any way radical or extreme, they're conservative. And so they will circumscribe, in a kind of soft way, certain choices for young women quite often. The choice of husband and partner, to some extent where they live, and so on. That kind of background. There's nothing conservative about extremist organizations. These are militant. They're empowering in that sense. We have to remember that, because I think we have a tendency to think of these movements as conservative, and they're not. But the other part of it, I think, is a kind of failure of the emancipatory project of the West, the kind of Sex in the City culture of feminism that kind of objectifies women. We've talked to girls over and over who've abandoned the practices, the Islamic practices of their parents and of their grandmothers and their mothers, and have taken on certain practices, including, for instance, the wearing of the niqab, as a way of saying, this is me reclaiming myself. It's saying no to the objectification that I feel in this environment, and I feel it as an empowerment. And I think all of these things are counterintuitive for the general public, but have to be understood if we're going to get ahead of this. And I just want to raise this question about the gender dynamic across different ideologies. I think is really important. We run a network of former extremists. It's now a global network of people who've been part of extremist and terrorist organizations of all different ideologies. And what's fascinating is how similar their stories are, whether they are former neo-Nazis or white supremacists or Islamists of different sorts, how similar their personal journeys often are. But the gender dynamic in terms of the old far right, you talked about the new right, the old neo-Nazi far right is interesting, because most of these kinds of extremist organizations have a very, very arcane view. I wouldn't say it's necessarily misogyny, but it's an arcane view of the position of women. So they see women in supportive roles as domestic support and so on. That's quite common across the board. And then at the same time, we're seeing women in all sorts of ways actually pushing those boundaries within the movement. And so we see them find more activist roles no matter what, even though they're circumscribed. And we've seen that in Palestine, we've seen that in Chechnya, and I think that we'll be seeing that later with these girls. So some of the accounts that we've been following of these young girls are saying, sadly, I'm not allowed to go out and fight now, but maybe, God willing, the day will come. And the narrative is incredibly violent. They're inciting violence. They're saying, if you can't get out here, do something back home. I want to be the first woman to behead somebody with a blunt knife. There's a sense of real aggression, of wishing to be part of the fight, that we also have to get a real, hand on, because it makes you turn away. You can't imagine that women would be that keen on the levels of violence that we're seeing. But it's part of the emancipatory sort of empowerment narrative that underlies all of it.
Sure. And do you think that in some ways the British state, the schools, the police, the government are in effect letting these girls, their families down. I mean, there was obviously some talk from the three girls that went from Bethnal Green that their friend had gone and the police had gone to the school, but the parents weren't informed properly. I just wondered, in terms of what the authorities are doing to stop this and to try and help with de-radicalisation, whether, Sasha, then Shabana, whether you thought that these families, these girls are actually being let down?
Well, I think that there's a number of things happening. We've seen now a whole slew of individuals end up in Syria that were on watch lists and somehow slipped through the net. And it begs the question, what's happening with that? I think there is a major challenge, both in terms of numbers, but the approach, I think, has really been problematic in so many ways. We talked about the government's strategies for prevention, which for, operating now for nearly a decade, I think has largely alienated people. It's been a highly divisive policy. It's, securitized the whole community debate. And in actual fact, the only way you can get around this issue is working with the families in the first place of individuals. What we do know is, for the very most part, these young people go off despite their families' wishes. There's a lot of peer-to-peer, sort of in the same age group, camaraderie, so families can play a role in that sense, but in terms of, there's a generational divide, and for the most part, parents are trying to do something to stop. So work with parents is absolutely critical. I think there needs to be a protection ethos in terms of the way in which we approach this, and protecting young people, not just girls. I think it's really important to remember that young boys at 15 and 16 are just as vulnerable and stupid as their female counterparts in terms of being able, in terms of being groomed online. This isn't grooming of a traditional sexual nature. It does go across the board. But the one thing we do know, and we've been developing some programs in this space, is that it's really hard for frontline workers, whether it's teachers or social workers, the sorts of people that are most likely to see that something's going on with a young person, to see some changes emerging that they think could lead in a negative direction. They rarely have the tools to be able to confront people up front in a way that is both sensitive and not counterproductive. And I think there's a real challenge there in terms of being able to enable difficult conversations to happen early on, both in school and community settings, and then bringing in families and communities in serious ways. And we've developed a program now that we've piloted, we've launched across Canada. It's a national campaign called Extreme Dialogue, which is a set of really, really painful, hard-hitting films of former extremists, films of victims of extremism, the personal human stories that matter, people who've been intimately involved with these problems, that can speak to their personal journeys. And to bring those into classroom settings with guides and tools for teachers at the front line to start to have very difficult conversations before kids are being drawn in, before they're starting to get radicalized, when they're 12 and 13 and 14, so get ahead of the curve. And that hasn't happened at scale yet.
Well, thank you so much to Shabana, to Sasha, to Åsne. Just to say, Åsne's book, if you're interested in extremism, has had fantastic reviews. Thank you very much to the panel for an amazing discussion. Thank you.